Welcome to the Parker Avery podcast series, Talk Retail to Me. Today, we're diving into one of the most critical, dynamic aspects of retail, pricing. Joining us are Jeff Kittell and Robert McGuire, along with Eddy Salas from our competitive pricing intelligence partner, DataWeave. So gentlemen, we often hear the phrase, we live in interesting times. And while it may be overused, there's no denying its relevance in pricing today. So the rapid evolution of generative AI, inflationary pressures, economic uncertainty, and shifting trade policies have made agility not just an advantage, but a necessity. In this episode, we'll explore how retailers can navigate these complexities and stay ahead in an increasingly competitive landscape. Before we get started, though, let's go through a round of introductions. Jeff, let's kick it off with you.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. First, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to join the podcast. It's an honor to be speaking with you and with Robert and with Eddy. My name is Jeff Kittell. I started my career as an Army intelligence officer and then transitioned into the private sector for the last 20 years. I've been building and leading revenue management and pricing teams for B2B companies and for retail companies, building go-to-market strategies, leading price transformations, implementing new solutions, and really trying to bring analytics into the decision-making process for more strategic decision-making to grow and grow profitably.
And I'm Robert McGuire. I've been in retail coming up on 20 years or so now and have worked at a variety of different types and sizes of retailers. Really enjoyed my time staying close to the customer and bringing a data-oriented approach to everything I do. The last 10 years or so, really focusing in on pricing and promotion. It's been really fun to learn how to apply analytics in a really specific way that can be really impactful to your customers and to your company.
I've actually got to say, it's a joy to actually be able to talk with other pricers in the industry and get the experts in the room, because it's very rare that we get to have a collaborative conversation. So thanks for the invite. Definitely excited to kind of go through this. My name is Eddy Salas. I lead retail strategy for DataWeave. So really helping customers understand the nuances of retail, competitive intelligence, and the like. Prior to my time at DataWeave, I actually spent 31 years with HEB, the last 20 of it in pricing. During my tenure there, essentially led the pricing efforts through the organization, everything from infrastructure to working with the leadership in terms of price strategy, reporting insights. Really fall in love with the pricing arena and always excited to have conversations about it.
Awesome. Thank you, Eddy. So with that, let's jump right in. And let's start with industry trends. So Robert, what advancements in pricing technology and analytics are reshaping the retail industry?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sam. As you hinted at in your intro, there's a lot happening in the world of technology that's really directly applicable to pricing these days. First and foremost, you can't talk without talking about AI these days. And AI can have lots of different applications. It's such a broad term. In the world of pricing in particular, it can be incredibly helpful to harness some of the power of language models, which can help with a lot of classification and segmentation and grouping activities that you need. And that often is in the data sets that you need. As an example, in a recent project I was on, we used over just a couple of rounds of iterations of training a language model, we achieved a 90% accurate match rate to competitive pricing. And those are on private label products, which are traditionally really difficult to match. And that was a big win for us for efficiency-wise and speed. Another component that's super important about what's happening in the world of pricing today has to do with integrated analytics. We're getting to a point in time where the tools are getting good enough and the cloud infrastructure and the models are strong enough to connect pricing to supply chain to other systems that you have to really make an integrated and holistic decision, whereas previously there were lags between the two and it was difficult. So that's an important trend and one that can really lead to a lot of success. And I think finally, all of those things are leading to the opportunity for some retailers to implement dynamic pricing. So if you can get your data right, if you can get an integrated system right, then you can put together a dynamic system that takes all those into account at once. And in some cases, immediate changes in price to execute your strategy lead to timing advantages over your competitors and better service for your customers.
Robert, love that, especially in the integrated signals. I've been talking about that for the last 25 years, right? And I'm glad it's really catching on. So certainly wholeheartedly agree. Eddy, Robert just brought up the idea of AI and automation, but there's a fine line, right? So there's a balance, I would say, between human expertise and machine-driven decisions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, sure thing. AI, you're hearing it everywhere. There's a lot of positive connotations associated with it, but there's a lot of negative connotations with it. Because there are definitely a lot of efficiencies that can get created with AI, not just in the pricing space, but in retail in total. The interesting analogy that I like to use that someone once told me is AI is almost like an intern. And you bring an intern in, doesn't mean you're just going to relinquish your key strategies or pricing or execution associated with it. So the intern's going to be there to learn. It's going to be able to kind of, help, elevate. And that elevation isn't going to be taking leaps and bounds. There are going to be small incremental steps to be able to help build up that foundation. I think AI is actually that same way as well. You're always going to need kind of that human element. The 100% reliance on technology, especially in the pricing world, one hallucination, on the AI side of it can cost millions and millions of dollars. So while AI can help out in terms of the insights and some efficiencies, you're always going to have that human element just because of how critical pricing is to the overall P&L. So it definitely is going to have a big play, but just like that intern, you're not just going to let them loose or let AI loose in the overall environment.
So it can take over a lot of the tasks, which just the rudimentary tasks can actually leave the human to do more of the value add work, right?
Exactly. So, touching on something Robert said in terms of where it can play, I still remember the days where you have category managers trying to link products up manually, whether it's a private label, whether you're trying to match up to maybe a club store because you've got differentiated UPCs. What happens if a website doesn't necessarily have UPCs, but they have the exact item match? So instead of trying to do that manually, the value add is layering in AI on top of that to really create these recommendations. And it depends on how comfortable you are. Do you allow them to go through? Do you still have oversight? But because you start freeing up that time, you can now start really spending a lot of that in pricing strategy, competitive intelligence, and the like.
I like the way you're talking about that, Eddy, in terms of AI almost like an intern, but not as a way to reduce the labor of your pricing team, but the way to pivot the way your pricing team spends its time and shifting a focus from data wrangling, data manipulation to now taking the insights, the patterns that AI can find within the data, and making smart decisions that are consistent with your strategy, making smart decisions that are consistent with the identity that you're building in your consumer's mind to make good choices. There's so much data that we have available now, so many different demand signals that we have available now. AI is a great tool for identifying those patterns.
Exactly. And to your point, it even helps with getting out of the manual tasks. I mean, we've all been pricing, and I mean, when you think about pricing systems and execution systems, they get pretty complicated. What type of tag am I going to put out there? Am I putting that to a certain price zone? Am I looking at a specific store? And each one of these retail databases can get pretty complicated in terms of how you actually execute it. Well, imagine if you have like an AI wrapper on top of that says, I want to, for Houston, I want to take that particular item from this price to this price, and I want that as an EDLP price change. Instead of trying to figure out what that coding looks like, on an upload or trying to do it within a pricing system, the spoken language to be able to actually do something like that, it really starts kind of bridging that gap. I've always called pricing a simple complexity. The more simple it is, the more adoption you're going to be able to get, and then the more buy-in you're actually going to get into the whole thing.
I agree with a lot of that. Can we double click on the agile pricing framework a little bit? I mean, we talked a little bit about AI, but are there other factors that allow us to put in place an agile pricing framework that allow for example, for real-time adjustments, but also while maintaining profitability?
The biggest enabler of agility is having a clear strategy. It's knowing who you are, and having plans in place for how you're going to act and how you're going to react. If you haven't thought through those things, if you haven't understood who you are in the market, then anytime something happens, you're going to be scrambling to figure out, what should I do? So for me, the first clear thing to do when I join a company is to start working with the leadership team, building a go-to-market strategy, identifying what are our clear, unique values that we deliver to the market, the quality of our products, our services, the customer experience we offer, and then take a hard look in the mirror around, what does your competitor offer? Maybe that's better to you. And then where does that net out from a value perspective? And once you understand that sort of net value differential, then you can start understanding how you want to act and react in the market, whether it's cost changes, whether it's consumer behavior, anything that's happening in the market, you then have a playbook for how to react. The other enabler is having efficient processes for communication and action. So a little bit about what Robert talked about in the beginning, but it's having the processes so that supply chain can talk to pricing, merchandising can talk to pricing, retail teams can talk to pricing and help provide clear communication about what's going on. Having a good analytic cadence where your analysts are recognizing those changes, they understand the strategy, they know how they're going to react, and then having an efficient sort of execution process. One of the things, because we've all been in situations where once an analyst has reviewed what's going on in the market, looked at performance, looked at some of those change variables and come up with a recommendation, sometimes if people have inefficient processes, that approval can get bogged down. So one of the things I like to do is really have a sort of range of freedom established, where in order to create that agility that you're talking about, Sam, there's a range of freedom that we give to the analyst to act within X and Y parameters. If they need to go outside of those parameters, then again, your process calls on an escalation where more review is needed. But having something like that in place really allows for that quick change, that quick responsiveness to the market that helps you kind of really live the promise that you make to your consumers.
If I could tag on to that, one of the things that I absolutely love what you said is the importance of that clarity in strategy and the involvement of senior leaders. Senior leaders need to get involved in price. And pricing has got to move from a very tactical unit to a very strategic unit. And as senior leaders actually get involved in those discussions, pricing is not just seen as a P&L lever. It's actually used as a competitive advantage. So the more senior leaders can get involved, the more pricing teams can really open up from a more tactical perspective to, hey, I have strategies. How do we achieve those strategies, both from a price image, price index perspective, along from a profitability perspective as well. But that really starts at the top in how you actually establish that and really set the standard for the organization and how to navigate that price.
Jeff and Eddy, I think I might just add, I agree that it needs to start at that level. I just might add a couple of components that might be important for your pricing team execution. It really depends on the type of systems that you have in place and where you are in your level of sophistication as a pricing team. So we touched on dynamic pricing earlier, right? So let's say that you're at that level. Well, one of the most important things to know about a dynamic and automated system, of course, is that it's probably very good at situations that it's seen before, but you need to test for those extreme situations that might be coming up. So really doing some stress testing if you have a more automated system. Most retailers are likely somewhere not quite that far, right? And so it might be important to develop a couple of different tactics to achieve agility. You might be working on your sophistication, which is a full optimization type pricing model, but that might be quite slow. So you need to have the foresight to plan, okay, if something is needed to be done much more quickly, let me create a quick reaction process. And to Jeff's point, and let's talk about to streamline decision rights. Let's talk about how we're going to scope what needs to take place. And let's talk about how we're going to make sure either of those systems maintains our strategy, for example, protecting your KVIs during inflationary periods and trying to make it up on the rest of your items.
I think that's right, Robert. I think once you've got your strategy clearly identified and articulated, one of the next steps to do is really map out your end-to-end process, and not just what's happening within the pricing team, but what's happening upstream from pricing and downstream from pricing. Because, you know, it's important to understand when there's supply shortages. It's important to understand when there's supply excesses. It's important to understand when you've got cost changes coming in. It's also important to understand what your timeline looks like from the time an analyst hits the submit button on a price change to the time that that's active in your scales, in your POS system, when you've got labels available to hang on the shelf. You need to analyze that chain end to end and really try to build efficiency into that process.
I like keep on going back to that team environment in terms of really what creates a powerhouse pricing organization. And it's not solely the pricing team. You know, I made mention a little bit earlier, senior leaders need to get involved in it. But just as critical, where's the digital team to be able to help support pricing efforts, to be able to help support the processes, the efficiencies? Strategies, in my opinion, are just words until you have the technology and ability to be able to do that. So if you want to shift strategy because there's a new competitor that's coming into play, that's really good. Do I have the mechanisms? Do I have the collections? And do I have the ability to actually process all the way through? So that the pricing organization now starts becoming a little bit more well-rounded. Where does category management and merchandising come into play? Where does senior leaders come into play? Where does digital come into play? Where does pricing come into play? And the synergy and the concert between those entities really create a very, very solid foundation, moving pricing from a purely tactical perspective to a fully functioning strategic unit.
Yeah, one more thing I'd like to add on agility onto all of this is to be able to move quickly. What I found is that you're interfacing with a lot of different places, especially merchandising, right? Store labor and so on. And what you need to be able to do is to say, well, when I'm pulling these particular levers, what does this mean to you in terms of how many additional labor hours am I going to need? How is that going to affect the mix in my particular category? How is this going to affect the financial metrics in my category and so on? And so while you're pulling those levers, you really need to understand all of those different factors and be able to communicate that quickly to have any sort of agility. Otherwise, you're going to run into roadblocks. Gentlemen, let's move to some external factors. So Eddy, can we talk a little bit about the role of external factors in making pricing decisions? Let's talk a little bit about things like consumer sentiment. Obviously, these days we're going to have to talk about tariffs, right? And then, of course, competition as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a lot going on in the marketplace, you know, and yeah, we can talk about U.S., but I mean, there's just a global ramification associated with it. I've always liked looking at things from a customer or consumer perspective, and the reality is that, you know, consumers' disposable income is coming down. There's a lot of different reasons that's going on. When you look back to 2014, 2015, prices today are about 35% higher. It's just that post-COVID inflation, you know, everything's kind of going on with tariffs. So you're seeing the pressure more and more and more that's occurring in the overall. How does that impact pricing strategies? As a retailer, you know, do I decide to invest in EDLP, an everyday low price, knowing that is going to be a permanent hit on my overall P&L? Do I try and go more the value game and actually play more on the promotional type of strategy? You know, so there's a lot of decisions to play. What happens when I do get a cost change? Do I decide to hold as long as I can before competition moves? Or do I decide to take a stand for that given item? So there's a lot of ramifications that's going on in the global marketplace that's really causing pricing organizations and retailers to not only think differently, but also think quickly, because these things are just coming in left and right. Sometimes you got to think about what that long-term plan is. Do you potentially sacrifice short-term profitability for long-term sustainability? And how do you establish your pricing strategies to be able to do that? Because at the end of the day, you want to be able to take care of your customers. I'd much rather keep a customer over the long term, maybe lose a little bit of profitability on the front side. These are the decisions that are in the boardrooms right now. You know, tariffs, there's a lot of uncertainty. You know, what's going on with Student loans is uncertainty. I mean, inflation is an uncertainty. So there's got to be a lot of fleetness and decision making in terms of what's going on in the overall.
Eddy, you're right. There's so much going on right now that are impacting consumers, that are creating stress for both consumers and for retailers. One of the things that I heard you say in there that I think is so important is how you react really starts with what your strategy is and who you are in the market, and staying true to that. There's times when retailers do need to reevaluate their strategy and think about pivoting on their strategy. But short of at those times, how you react needs to happen within your strategy and maintaining your promise to the market. And retailers shouldn't be looking at reacting as a binary decision. I react or I don't react. It's really, how do you play in between those two things to react in a way that protects your profitability, that protects your customer price perception. And so it requires an understanding of your consumers. It requires an understanding of what drives them to shop with you versus your competitors. It requires an understanding of the roles of the various categories within your store, and how you react should represent the roles of those categories. And so if you've got cost changes coming in on a very elastic, very sensitive item, you need to think through things like, is this cost just impacting me, or is this impacting everybody in the market? What do I know about my competitors, and how do I think they're going to react? And then if I think this isn't something that they're going to pass along, I have a choice then of either passing it along myself and breaking that value differential that I've been trying to hold and maintaining, which sounds to me kind of like breaking my strategy, or do I think about how to maybe reallocate those cost impacts into less elastic, less sensitive items and maintain my profitability, but also maintain my customer price perception and my strong market position.
One thing that you've said brought to mind the importance of the timing of your analytical assessments and the frequency of them. When we're in a marketplace that's changing, it might be important to schedule refreshes of some of those high-level analytics that are fueling your strategy, that are informing what's most important to your core customers. Maybe instead of doing that on a biannual basis every 2 years, maybe you need to shorten that up in times of change like we're going through right now, so that you ensure that if customer sentiment is changing and customer perception and priorities are changing, that you change your tactical lists as well, so that the categories and the items that are most important to them, that you're staying true to what that is.
And I think you can circle that conversation back to our earlier conversation about now leveraging tools, leveraging AI, leveraging data, right? The costs of all of those things are coming down so much that you can build processes now around having a much greater abundance of data, having tools and systems that can sift through all of the gigabytes and terabytes of data that you have to find the needles in a haystack and identify where you need to make moves so you can do those quickly and be responsive to the market, versus maybe waiting for an annual or semi-annual category review.
Going back to another conversation from earlier, your intern AI. If I take a look at a pricer or whoever's managing pricing at the end of the day, if today they're spending 50% of the time on manual efforts and 50% of the time on pricing strategy, I'd love it for it to be 5 or 10% on manual, because you're not going to be able to solve everything, but be able to spend 95% on pricing strategy, right? And that's really where everything starts coming together.
So gentlemen, as we're starting to see retailers get competitive pricing more often, how do we avoid the race to the bottom? So Jeff, can you talk a little bit about how do we avoid the destructive price wars?
I mean, really, that's about game theory, and it's about, I'm starting to feel a little repetitive, but it's about knowing your strategy and staying true to your strategy. Ultimately, there's only one winner of a price war. And, for most retailers, it's not you. And customers may think that, price war is good for them, and maybe it is in the very short term, but in the long term, it's also not good for customers, right? It reduces long-term competitiveness in the market and ultimately consumer choice and consumer pricing. So The number one way to avoid destructive price wars is to know your game and to win at your game. Don't try to win your competitor's game, win your game. Being competitive doesn't mean you have to be the lowest price in the market. And as I said, for most retailers, you're not going to be the lowest price in the market, but it means your price has to be market relevant. You need to be very aware of where the competitor is at any point in time. You've got to be aware of that, and you've got to maintain your value differential to that competitor. Part of that, as I mentioned kind of earlier, is pattern recognition. There's a lot of data out there, and if you look over time, you can see how your competitors react to your price changes, to other price changes in the market, to cost changes. And if you start observing those patterns, you can start to anticipate what they're going to do with upcoming changes. And you build your strategy to anticipate that. If you know that your strategy is not to be a hard discounter, don't go out there and try to undercut hard discounters and do aggressive tactics like putting a shopping cart in the front of the store, the big sign saying we're cheaper than guy X down the street. If that's not a strategy you can win and maintain, play to your strategy. To me, that's really the primary way to avoid a destructive price war, is to know your value and to stick to your value. And then the second way, beyond communicating and reinforcing your value, is to think about other less aggressive tactics. So if you need to get more competitive, think about doing that with a promotional mechanism. Think about doing that with personalized offers, with rewards, with other more subtle but also impactful mechanisms, as long as you're first maintaining your core strategy.
I think that says a lot. Understanding who you are and playing to your strengths, but also understanding your competitor strategy as well. If you're a EDLP operator and you're going up against a high-low operator, they're two completely different strategies that are out there. And if I take a simple route and say, I'm going to go ahead and follow a high-low operator, well, I essentially move from EDLP to high-low. So being able to understand the competitive aspects of it are very important, because you do want to play into their strengths. And this is the beauty of retail. It's not even just a pricing conversation. Now this becomes an assortment conversation. Where do I potentially leverage own brand? Where do I potentially go and try and procure an item to be able to secure the cost that I need to get to the price that I want? It's the beauty of synergies of merchandising, of assortment, of price. They're all coming together. And in a lot of ways, I've always said price image goes further than just your pricing. How is it being displayed on the shelf? What's your marketing? What's your sales tactics? So there's a variety of mechanisms, but you've got to play to your strengths, but you've also got to understand what's going on in the overall marketplace.
Yeah, Jeff and Eddy, I totally agree. And you're hitting on all the points that are going through my head as well. It was thinking back to a research report that I've often used, and a framework that I've often used, that points to the importance of price image and price perception. That as you guys are saying, the report and framework I've looked at has stated that the price image or the price perception can drive up to 50% of your sales outcome. But to your point, just like you both have said, price image is not just your base pricing. About 35% of your price image comes from base price alone. And the rest of it is coming from those other areas that you're mentioning: promotion, personalized offers, the prevalence of private label in your assortment, et cetera.
And Robert, can you talk a little bit about financial impact and metrics? I mean, oftentimes, there's a big concentration on margin, right? So if you look at some of the price optimization tool sets in the market today, and it's been this way for a while, we focus on gross margin, right?
Right.
And that's obviously a big metric for pricing, but for a well-rounded pricing strategy, what other financial metrics should you be tracking?
Sure, Sam. That's a very important question, and a pretty broad one, because there's lots of things you need to track. I think the very first thing I would say is that make sure that whatever solution that you're implementing enables you to balance between sales and unit growth or transaction growth and margin. You need to be able to aim this pricing tool in a variety of different ways so that each category can hit the strategy that it's intended to deliver for your company. I think the other really important component is to ensure that you've got customer level data that you can track. So you want to, at a basic level, be able to track if your average basket size is growing or shrinking in response to your tactics, whether your trip frequency is changing. You may want to calculate your customer lifetime value and use that in your reasoning for investments that you're making. So that's very important. One level down from there that I would emphasize is making sure that whatever customer level data you have, you're able to segment your customers into your customer groups. I know in my experience and in my past, there have been some organizations where we've calculated that our highly engaged customers are 10 to 15 times as valuable financially to the company as the occasional customers are. And so, especially in times of financial stress, you need to be taking care of those core customers, making sure that they're getting what they need, that you're serving their needs, and hope that you can keep them, attract others like them. Now, if we need to do some acquisition strategies, we also have a segmentation and some tactics that can be specific to them.
Robert, I think that's so important. As you think about the traditional metrics, looking at revenue, profit, margin, transactions, or unit sales, those are all great and critical metrics for us to look at, but they're a little bit rearward looking. The consumer or the customer metrics that you're talking about are good leading indicators in a way of the effectiveness of your strategies and whether you're bringing more people to your store or whether people are finding other outlets for their needs. And that helps you gauge whether your strategy is effective or not effective. Are people coming more often? So customer growth, customer purchase frequency, the number of items that they're putting in the basket when they're coming. Are they coming and they're so compelled by your offering that next time they're putting one more item, two more items in? And then, of course, looking at share, your market share. It's a traditional measure, but it helps sort of neutralize out some of the broader market impacts.
Y'all are exactly right. There are a lot of different metrics. There are a lot of different ways to be able to kind of take a look at things. One component that's critically important is also time. And what I mean by that is that there are going to be a lot of instances where history is rewriting itself. So all the history that I had prior to COVID, or all the history that I had, post-COVID into the inflationary timeframes, may give us false positives. So how do you be a little bit nimble in terms of that analysis to be able to help set forth what that strategy is in shifting of metrics? There may be one metric that worked a couple of years ago, or a couple of metrics. Today may be something completely different. You want to be able to have like that discontentment with the status quo. Is always question, always challenge, and always look at things a little bit differently. The marketplace is changing so rapidly and so fast, not just from an economic level, but from a technology level. And it's causing everyone to really, think quick on their feet to be able to succeed in the overall.
That's such an important point, Eddy. I'm glad you made that because it's critical in this day and age where the last 5 years have been 5 years of really unprecedented impacts in the market. Thinking about whether you want to maintain the metrics or if some metrics have become more important or less important, critical. The other thing I would add to that is thinking about some of the new technologies or offerings where you can source some of the old metrics that you've been using, but maybe from new, more accurate sources.
Well said. Well, thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure. Obviously, a lot of insightful conversation here. So enjoyed it. Eddy, Robert, Jeff, thank you so much for your time. Looking forward to our next conversation.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks very much.
Sam.
That's a wrap for this episode of Talk Retail to Me. If you have questions related to today's topic, please visit our website at parkeravery.com to learn more and to contact us. Also, we'd love it if you shared Talk Retail to Me with any of your colleagues. It's streaming on all the major podcast platforms, and the videos are available on our YouTube channel. For more Parker Avery industry expertise and advice, be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.